So in July, the WBC welterweight champion Mario Barrios is set to defend his title against a 46-year-old Manny Pacquiao who hasn't competed in a professional boxing match since his 12-round unanimous decision loss to Ennis back in August of 2021. So it would have been just a month shy of a 4-year layoff by the time this upcoming fight takes place. The WBC ranked the inactive 46-year-old at number 5 in their welterweight rankings last week to facilitate Pacquiao's comeback and allow him to compete for their belt. This has rightfully arose complaints about the corruption of the WBC and the sport of boxing as a whole. But for me, this has reaffirmed this notion that I've had for over a year or so now, that the welterweight division is currently not in the best place and hasn't seen much action in the way of high-level competitive world title fights as compared to the divisions either side of it, the super lightweight division and the super welterweight division, since the undisputed welterweight world title fight between Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford in July of 2023. When I say competitive world title fights, I mean competitive on paper as opposed to bouts that are closely contested in the ring. Now I haven't been too vocal about this notion of mine about the welterweight division because in boxing, I understand that belts get scattered all the time with unified and undisputed champions moving up in weight or maybe even retiring, leaving all of the belts to be contested for in vacant title fights or interim champions being elevated to full champions. Divisions can become livelier at any point with big stars from the weight class below moving up into it. And the main champion of the welterweight division right now in Jaron Ennis, who is now a unified champion, is of course a great fighter, so I never wanted to discredit him by making out that he's operating in an easy division or anything like that. And most of all, there's no one in particular to really blame or point the finger at for the state that the welterweight division is in right now. It's all circumstantial. And I did want to give it a bit of time for the division to possibly pick up a bit before I started going crazy and naming it a bad division. But now that we've got this Pacquiao vs Barrios fight for the WBC title, it's probably the right time to give my little casual take. So say what you will about the undisputed title clash between Crawford and Spence not being the fight it was meant to be due to Errol Spence's big car accident in 2019, which led to some inactivity and supposedly started a deep decline of his boxing abilities, and that fight happening too late because of the accident along with boxing politics. But what that Spence vs Crawford fight was a culmination of a star-studded welterweight division that we had in the last few years prior to that fight, as both men boasted multiple world title fight victories over big names in the division. The 4 belts that were finally being unified together had all separately been contested for in high profile bouts involving men who followed the same sort of chain of common opponents that both Spence and Crawford were involved with. And when that climactic undisputed title fight took place, Terence Crawford was victorious with a dominant beatdown of Spence to ultimately pick up all 4 welterweight world title belts. After becoming undisputed, Crawford did not proceed to defend the titles because his goal was to move up in weight, and he did indeed go on to pick up gold at 154 in his next fight after beating Spence. And the former unified champion in Errol Spence has not boxed again since that undisputed fight, and it's safe to assume that he will never box again unfortunately, so there was no attempt from him to gain any of his belts back. So the belts did get completely scattered. Well, long before Crawford's move up in weight to challenge for one of the super welterweight titles against Israel Madrimov was made official, he was stripped of the IBF welterweight title as he was originally supposed to rematch Errol Spence. But the IBF mandatory at the time was Jaron Ennis, who won that interim title against Karen Jakadzian in January 2023 and once defended the interim strap against Royman Villa. And we know that the IBF don't hold out for rematches. So they stripped Crawford of the IBF belt and upgraded Ennis to full champ in November of 2023. So Jaron Ennis was the first to become a full world champion at 147 after Terence Crawford became undisputed. But he existed as a world champion in the division at the same time as Crawford still held the other 3 belts at that time. So nothing too diminishing to the division at all here. Jaron Ennis is today the best champion at welterweight, the IBF do what the IBF do, and Crawford hadn't officially gone up to 154 yet. Now the other 3 champions that had picked up titles after Crawford dropped the belts were all upgraded to full champ when Crawford was officially up at super welterweight already. The WBC champion Mario Barrios was the next welterweight to be upgraded to full champion. He won the vacant WBC interim strap against Ennis in September of 2023, defended the interim title once against Fabian Maidana, and was then upgraded to full champion in June of 2024 when Crawford was already confirmed to fight Madrimov. The WBC didn't strip Crawford of their welterweight title however, but made him the champion in recess just to keep things nice and complicated. The next one to become a full welterweight world champion was Brian Norman Jr., after Crawford had already fought and defeated Madrimov for super welterweight gold. So after Crawford's win over Madrimov on August 3rd of 2024, it was announced on August 12th that Crawford had vacated the WBO welterweight title, and the interim WBO welterweight champion Brian Norman Jr. had been upgraded to full champion. Norman won that WBO interim title in a vacant title fight against Giovanni Santillan back in May of 2024. So the last of the bunch to become a full world champion was the one who is no longer champ right now, Imantis Stanionis. Let's just acknowledge the WBA regular belt as the interim title and the super title as the full world title here to not convolute this all too much. So Crawford officially vacated his WBA welterweight title on August 30th of 2024, and the regular champion Stanionis was then upgraded to the main WBA champ at 147. So Terence Crawford was then officially no longer a welterweight champion at all, and just held his WBA world title at 154 that he won from Israel Madrimov. So Stanionis won the WBA regular belt off of Radzab Batayev back in April 2022, and defended the regular belt once against Gabriel Maestre in May of 2024, before getting upgraded to the main champion in August. So quickly before we look at where we're at today, at the point of Stanionis being upgraded to full champ, and we had 4 different welterweight world champions after Crawford had officially moved on from the division, the 4 champions were Jaron Ennis, Mario Barrios, Brian Norman Jr. and Imantis Stanionis, all champions who had been upgraded from interim champs essentially. At the point of Stanionis being upgraded, Jaron Ennis had made 1 defense of the full IBF title against David Avanesian, and of course the other 3 champions were yet to defend their respective titles. But today, we of course have 3 welterweight world champions as opposed to 4. The division is no longer fully scattered, so to speak. Last month, Jaron Boots Ennis faced off against the WBA champ Imantis Stanionis in a world title unification fight, and Boots put on a clinical performance for the stoppage victory as Stanionis retired in the corner after the 6th round. So Boots became the unified IBF and WBA welterweight champ, and was awarded the Ring Magazine welterweight title as a result of winning the unification. The only other 2 Ring Magazine welterweight champions of the last 18.5 years have been Terence Crawford and Floyd Mayweather Jr., so holding that strap is no joke. So I reiterate, Boots Ennis, the unified champ at 147, hell of a fighter, but as good as you think he is, one guy doesn't make the division great. So as for Stanionis, not to discredit Boots' win over him, because Stanionis was a solid undefeated fighter with good wins on his record, but he was an incredibly inactive champion, didn't box for over 2 years after first winning that WBA regular belt, and hadn't boxed for 11 months at the point of this Boots fight. Stanionis also spoke in an interview before the Boots fight about how he doesn't like to get a lot of rounds in when sparring in the gym. So although you can argue that the fight might not have gone so differently if Stanionis was more active and more conditioned in the way of sparring, due to Boots' superior skill set and the fact that a compactly built high guard fighter like Stanionis can be easy pickings for a guy like Boots a lot of the time anyway. After Boots dropped Stanionis behind a barrage of body shots late in round 6, Stanionis quit in the corner after that round finished, as soon as things got real tough. Now I know Boots most likely would have won that fight anyway, but the fight wasn't completely one-sided, and although that can be viewed as a justified corner retirement from Stanionis due to the way the fight was going, trust me, many other fighters would have fought on under those circumstances. So I do think the fact that Stanionis didn't have the heart to come out for that 7th round was due to his inactivity in the ring, whether or not he could have won the fight or not. And no disrespect to Stanionis, but the fact that he was a world champion sort of speaks to the division's lack of depth at this current stanza. Now to look at the WBO champ Brian Norman Jr. So he has Stanionis quitting against Boots in the ring, but with Norman Jr., everyone says that he ducked a unification fight with Boots Ennis, as he was offered a sum of money to fight Boots that was much more than he's ever made in his career, and he and his father Brian Norman Sr. turned the offer down. Some people may think the Normans are justified to turn down the offer, as Norman Jr. is not ready to fight Boots just yet, but he will be at some point down the line. But here's the thing, it's not like Norman is a contender that's not ready for a world title fight yet. He's literally a full-on world champion right now. So how can he be a world champion if there's any notion that there's a guy in his division that he's not ready for yet? That's a little bit insane to me. So I like Brian Norman Jr. Very exciting up-and-coming fighter. Pulled off the upset against the 32-0 Santillan in a great fight to become the interim champ, and he has once defended the full world title since being upgraded, with a stoppage win over Derek Cuevas. And he's set to defend his title in Japan next month against Sasaki, which I am looking forward to. So it's not a travesty that Norman is a world champ by any means. We've had young fighters pick up world title belts before being ready to fight at a certain elite level all throughout modern boxing history. But if he is indeed not ready to fight Boots yet, then is he not just a prospect of a world title belt? Then we got Mario Barrios, the most disrespected of the bunch. and the man whose next scheduled title defense was the incentive for me to make this whole video about the recent history of the division. So Barrios is a good fighter, and I know there'll be hardcore boxing fans out there who could tell you all about Mario Barrios' last 10 fights and how they all went. But to more casual fans, he's literally known as the guy who was the defending WBA regular champ at super lightweight and lost that belt when he got stopped by Tank Davis, who came up 2 weight classes from super featherweight to take him on. That was back in 2021. Well, granted, Tank did have one fight up at 135 2 fights prior, but still. Then in Barrios' very next fight in 2022, he lost a 12-round unanimous decision to a Keith Thurman who was returning from a layoff of over 2.5 years. Fairly dominant decision win from Thurman as well, by the way. So this isn't me trying to be as pejorative as possible and making out like those back-to-back losses in 2021 and 2 define Mario Barrios, but correct me if I'm mistaken, those losses are what he's known for by a lot of fans. And when you look at his record, it's almost like, how do you even go about losing to Tank Davis and Keith Thurman back to back? One of them was mainly known as a super featherweight back then, and the other one was a welterweight who was in his prime in the mid-2010s basically. So although Pacquiao's return fight is against Mario Barrios because the WBC are the ones who rank Manny Pacquiao, and Barrios is of course their champion, and probably because Barrios is with the PBC too, it does almost seem like it's a thing where, if Barrios is the guy who Tank could beat when jumping up to 140, and the guy who Thurman could beat coming off of a layoff and off of a loss to a 40-year-old Manny Pacquiao, then if a 46-year-old Manny Pacquiao can come back and beat any champion, it's Mario Barrios, right? It's unfortunate that Barrios has that rep, but from what I've gathered, from what I've read and listened to, that is his rep. Now Barrios picked up the WBC interim title against Yordenis Ugas in 2023 as aforementioned, which is a valid accomplishment as far as I see it. And I speak about the welterweight division falling off from what it was a few years back, but back in 2019, a time that I'd personally argue the division was in a better place, Ugas challenged for Sean Porter's WBC welterweight title, and Ugas lost a controversial split decision to Porter in that fight. Many people thought that Ugas was robbed of a decision and of a knockdown in that fight. So Barrios becoming the welterweight world champion by beating Ugas for the interim title, then being upgraded, isn't something too different from what we could have seen take place in the division a few years back. People do say that Ugas was washed up when Barrios fought him because he was old and coming off of the loss to Spence, but let's just give Barrios the credit for making Ugas look to us with his dominant performance over him. But now, after one interim title defense, Barrios has defended his belt once as a full champion, and that was his 12-round draw against the not so highly regarded Abel Ramos on the Mike Tyson vs Jake Paul undercard on Netflix. So Barrios fights on the biggest stage possible and goes life and death with a challenger who people don't rate very much or have never even heard of and barely keeps his world title belt. Abel Ramos ain't a nobody, former WBA regular title challenger against Ugas funnily enough, but on the grand scheme of things, again, Ramos is not so highly regarded. So that Ramos fight reaffirms this thing of Barrios not being so successful in the fights that everyone is watching, so we don't have the best rep at all. But here's the ultimate point in regards to the welterweight division falling off. I have nothing against Brian Norman Jr. and Mantis Stanionis nor Mario Barrios at all, which is why I didn't speak badly about any of them just now. Individually, there is no problem with any of them being a world champ, but for all three of them to be world champion at once, that's a bit of a problem I reckon. Of course Stanionis ain't a champ anymore, but all three of these guys were just a world champion in the same weight class at once, along with Boots Ennis of course. So in the late 2010s let's say, you've got your Terence Crawford, Errol Spence, Sean Porter, Keith Thurman, Manny Pacquiao when he was only a young lad in his late 30s and just touching 40 as opposed to being 46, Kell Brook, Danny Garcia, an arguably better version of Ugas, amongst a good few other noteworthy names who kinda had their foot out the door at that point. Would there have been room for Brian Norman Jr., Mantis Stanionis and Mario Barrios amongst that crop of welterweights? Most certainly yes in fact. They would have all been top contenders and there's even room there for one of the three to possibly pick up a world title belt. But for all three of those guys to be world champion at once when the division had those names in it, it would have never happened, let's be honest. Norman is the prospect of a world title belt, Stanionis was the inactive fighter, and Barrios is the one who is known for his losses, and none of the three won the title off of a defending champion. So whichever one of them would have got a hold of a world title belt in an era gone by, would have been the weaker champion of the division at that time in theory. This is all just my opinion of course. Of course, Boots Ennis also did not win the belt off of a defending champ, and didn't really unify against a defending world champ either, an upgraded regular champ who was very inactive. I know Boots can only beat what's in front of him, but that's just the way it is. And I should also note that Boots has very much been seen as the boogeyman of boxing for a little while now, which is why I've had to explain that me talking down this division is nothing against Boots at all, because I'm contrasting this current welterweight era to the Spence Crawford era if you like, and many people will argue that Terence Crawford ducked Boots Ennis, which is why Boots originally got upgraded to full IBF champ, and why he now has to go chasing scattered belts. And some people also say that Errol Spence ducked Boots as well, because Ennis became IBF number 1 when Spence still held that belt. But the fact of the matter is that after fighting each other for undisputed, Spence and Crawford were no longer active welterweights. So it is what it is really, and that's why I say that nobody's at fault for the current state of the welterweight division. I also do have to acknowledge on the flip side that some people do reckon that Boots Ennis is very overrated, despite quite objectively being the best welterweight right now, which would further speak to the division's lack of quality if you don't rate Boots of course. Boots is not currently a top 10 pound for pound fighter by the Ring Magazine's rankings, despite being the current Ring Magazine welterweight champ. And I'm not sure how far you have to go back in time to find a point that the best welterweight in the world was not in the pound for pound top 10. People don't like how much Boots was getting caught against Avanesian in that fight, and a lot of people were not impressed by either of his fights with Chikadzian at all either. This current unified champ is seen by some as a clumsy fighter with a leaky defense who will finally be exposed when he gets in there with a big name. Now, although there's definitely a lot of truth to the criticisms around Boots Ennis, again, with the current state of the division, he is capable of speedrunning his way to undisputed as far as I see it. But of course, Brian Norman doesn't look like he's planning on fighting Boots in the near future, and now Mario Barrios is defending his belt against Pacquiao. If I had it my way, if Norman don't want the Boots fight just next, then fair enough. Go and try and unify against Barrios. That's the winnable fight, right? Then whoever wins out of Norman and Barrios would be the unified WBC and WBO welterweight champ. And then they can go and unify with the WBA and IBF welterweight champ Boots Ennis for undisputed. And if Norman does beat Barrios, then as a unified world champion, surely he'd be ready for Boots then. By the way, as much as I'd predict Boots Ennis to become undisputed, unless Norman Jr. shows some great improvements in his next couple fights and steps up the competition after the Sasaki fight, which is on the cards, Boots becoming undisputed at 147 would by no means be a solution to the way the division has gone since Crawford left it. Because Boots is one of these guys who always talks about going up to 54, and he looks like he struggles with the weight at 47. So Boots wouldn't even defend the undisputed welterweight title once, and the belts would get scattered all around yet again. But now, as for who has potential to do things in the welterweight division in the near future, maybe even pick up the vacant belts if they do indeed get scattered again, we have a bunch of guys coming up from 140 to 147, and they are bigger names than most of the guys who have been at welterweight. Rolly Romero is literally the current WBA regular welterweight world champ, won the vacant strap up of Ryan Garcia the other week in both men's debut in the weight class. Devin Haney is ranked number 1 in the WBC welterweight rankings, although his welterweight debut against Jose Ramirez was at a catch weight of 144 against a fellow 140 pounder in Ramirez, and Haney may still have gold on at 140, so we'll have to see about him. We also got Ryan Garcia himself, of course, if he can recover from that loss to Rolly. Former undisputed title challenger at 140 Jack Catterall, who is set to make his debut at welterweight against Harlem Eubank in July. And former undisputed 140 pound champion himself, Josh Taylor, who is set to face Echo Esserman at 47 this Saturday. So we'll see if any of these guys moving up from super lightweight can bring any stardom back to the welterweight division. Of course, you have other contenders at welterweight as well, like both Harlem Eubank and Echo Esserman, who I just mentioned, who both may very well win the upcoming fights against Jack Catterall and Josh Taylor respectively. Another up-and-coming welterweight contender from this side of the world who I like is the Irish Paddy Donovan, who does now have the burden of having to avenge his DQ loss to Lewis Crocker in a fight that he was dominating. Lewis Crocker is actually IBF number 1 as of right now because of that result. And there are a couple of popular names in the division right now like Conor Benn and Blair Cobbs, who might not be seen as top contenders in a more stacked division, but they've both been calling for that Mario Barrios fight for the WBC title, because they know it's the winnable fight. And I would have rather seen either Ben or Cobbs fight Barrios than a 46-year-old Pacquiao, I'll tell you that much. I do like Blair Cobbs, but he did not pick up from the momentum of the win over AB at all. A washed up AB, but it was a big name win in a fight that had a great build up. But the year of inactivity since that fight has really killed the hype. Hype that had potential to pick up a lot in my opinion. But that was apparently because Don King couldn't get Blair Cobbs any fights. Yet, being promoted by Don King in 2025 is crazy, I know. But Cobbs said that he has left Don King now, hoping to become more active. So we'll see where he can go from here. So back to that upcoming WBC welterweight title fight between Manny Pacquiao and Mario Barrios. I did just want to use that as a means to voice my opinions about the welterweight division that I've been quiet about for a good while. I'm not overly offended by this upcoming fight. I know Pacquiao is 46 years old and has been inactive from professional competition for 4 years, and had that 3-round exhibition against the kickboxer Ryan Ampo last year that he looked terrible in, so how is he going to look against an actual boxer in a 12-rounder a year on from that? But I haven't got an issue with him returning to boxing at this age. It's his choice as a man at the end of the day. And he has of course been involved with Filipino politics for several years now, and I think he just lost an election or something, so maybe he's just skit style and wants to throw hands again. Him getting a title shot is crazy and does highlight the corruption of the WBC, but if Barrios wasn't going to be in a unification next door or fight anyone who we actually want to see him fight, then I'm alright with this fight, I guess. Then I can't even lie. I know it's a travesty to the meritocracy of the sport, but boxing is a business at the end of the day. And seeing as Pacquiao is just Pacquiao and he's an all-time great, he brings astronomical name value and draws great international appeal. His return will actually be the welterweight fight with the most casual and worldwide appeal since the undisputed fight between Crawford and Spence back in 2023, which is crazy. Because Boots has been doing his thing and has become a unified champ, but outside of America, he's only really known by hardcore fans for the most part, as opposed to Pacquiao, who is of course world famous. After my predictions for Manny Pacquiao vs Mario Barrios, no matter what you think of Barrios, he beat your Dennis Ugas, who beat Manny Pacquiao in his very last pro fight. And of course Pacquiao looked like a shell of his former self in his exhibition last year and really showed his age that time around. So Mario Barrios is a big betting favourite for a reason, and I do expect Barrios to win. The odds are drastically different across the UK bookies who are offering odds for this fight already. Barrios is on average like 1 to 4ish, and Pacquiao is floating around at 4 to 1, but again the odds are drastically different across the bookies for both fighters. But they don't really differ in a way that any hedging or match betting is really worth the while though, before any of the degenerate gamblers get too excited. Unless you're dealing with 4-figure stakes and you're willing to lose it all in case of a draw. And I'm not sure what this fight really does for anyone though. Surely the return is a one-time thing for Pacquiao. If Barrios wins, as expected, it's a big name on Barrios' record for sure, but we all know that Pacquiao is an old man, so what does it really do? Maybe so casuals who rarely watch boxing are just made aware of his name? I don't know, but why Mario Barrios? And if Pacquiao does win, surely he doesn't go unify with Boots Ennis or Brian Norman. Pacquiao should just vacate the belt if he does win, then maybe the WBC could let a couple guys who came up from 140 fight for the vacant title, then they can go unify. Because it does seem like this is all happening just because Pacquiao wants to return and the WBC and PBC are both happy to make money off of it. And if Pacquiao did just come back, beat Barrios for the title, then instantly retire again, that would be pretty jokes. But yeah, you guys let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.